Why should we before start? This is your time.
Before starting,
Okay, go on.
Discuss the topic.
discuss the topic.
What do you want to talk about?
So I am here to talk about the differences between Islamic slavery and slavery as recorded in scriptures. Theologically, the Bible rejects slavery,
Okay.
and therefore those who read the Bible
The Old,
could
the Old Testament and New Testament, yeah?
both
Okay.
reject slavery.
Okay,
and
that's going to
therefore
be quite easy then.
Those who read the Bible
right.
could
No problem.
very
I
strongly
understand the topic.
reject the Bible.
I understand the topic.
Reject slavery.
I understand the
But in
topic.
contrast, in regards to Islam,
Right, can we get your time started then? Because we understand the topic.
what's the topic?
The topic is slavery, right? And the biblical / Quranic view of it, right?
Yeah.
All right, get started.
Quranic view.
If you have 4 minutes, get
Do
started.
you agree with Islamic slavery?
No, I'm happy with the topic, yes.
But do you agree?
No, give him 4 minutes. No, don't ask me questions. You want to start? You got your 4 minutes start. No, don't ask me questions.
No.
No,
The
no,
topic.
the topic is fine.
What is the topic?
The topic is slavery in the Bible and the Quran.
That's not a topic. Proposition.
Yes, it is a
What is the
topic.
proposition?
That's what you said. I'm happy with
The
it.
proposition.
Are you happy with that?
The proposition.
Yeah.
Islam
Yeah.
continues to have slavery.
Okay, no problem.
Underpinning its
Fine.
theology.
Okay, I disagree with it. If you're talking about
Good.
human to human slavery, not God to human, right? Is that what you mean?
Human to human slavery.
Fine, no problem. I'm against that proposition.
Okay, good. So
All right,
that's what we're talking about.
And also we're talking about the Bible, right?
Yeah, you
No
wanna start
problem. 4 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Do you want to go first?
No, you go first, sir.
You want to start now?
No, one second.
4 minutes, okay. 4 minutes. Right now.
Mohammed, can you buy me a bit? No, wait.
Brother, you buy it
All right, I'm
yourself.
going to look at
Okay, let's
start now, yeah?
Let's focus on the big topics and then we'll talk about these things later.
All right.
Go ahead.
4 minutes now.
Go ahead.
Okay, Islam approves of Islamic slavery, and therefore even until today, there is no theological basis to reject slavery according to Islam. Why does Islam propagate slavery? Point number one, Muhammad himself and the wider religion has a derogatory view on a few different people groups. Number one, black people. Number two, unbelievers. And especially women. A very derogatory view. And this resulted in harsh dealing by people, including Muhammad himself, of slaves. Harsh punishments, harsh dealing with slaves. Slaves were tortured, sex torture for female slaves. Slaves had no rights, and slaves had perpetual slavery, no legal rights, no civil rights. They were treated as merchandise and so on. According to Islam, there was no intention to manumit, i.e. to abolish slavery. Muhammad himself allowed Islamic slavery to be propagated until perpetuity. So Islam is a very bad model for today, because according to Islam, Islamic slavery is still a valid model to be practiced and will be practiced even till the end of times. In contrast, when we come to the Bible considers every human being to be similar. When we compare the Bible, Jesus Christ, with Muhammad, we see someone who is well fitting into the 21st century model, where we hate racism, where we hate slavery. So Jesus Christ is the only person that needs to be followed in terms of our modern views of slavery, abolishing of slavery, and our modern views on the fact of human beings being similar. Muhammad is not a good example for people of today, and therefore Muhammad ought to be rejected. So in particular, I'd like to ask the question to Muhammad, who is here. Muhammad, the so-called Islamic prophet, approves of having sex with captive women at will by Muslims. Do you think that's a very good model for today to practice? When Muslims go to capture non-Muslims, do you think Muslims should have the ability and the permission from Muhammad and the Islamic Allah to have sex with captive women at all times, anytime they want to. And do you agree with that principle? Do you think that upholds human values properly?
30 seconds.
Okay, go on.
You got 30 seconds.
You got 30 seconds.
No, that's
He's very
fine. Go on.
confident. He's very confident.
Thank you for joining the Sunday sparring sessions with subpar opponents like this man here, who clearly is not articulate enough and hasn't used enough evidences from the Quran or Sunnah. In fact, if I recall, he hasn't used any evidence at all. He had papers in his hand, but he didn't even quote a single verse from the Quran or a single hadith. Unfortunately today, what I will be doing is the opposite of that without the papers in my hand. So the Quran states something which refutes almost everything he states, which is in chapter 90 of the Quran, where it says, وَمَا أَدَرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ. What would make you know what the good way is? Freeing slaves is the good way. So the idea that the manumission of slaves or the emancipatory discourse was that which is not mentioned in the Quran, but in fact the opposite of is mentioned, is something directly refuted in the Quranic discourse. Now this verse, وَمَا أَدَرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ, is not an abrogated verse. Now I would like to know how my friend here has an answer for this verse. But not only this, we find in the Quran, in chapter 9, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions the categories of zakat, which is, as you know, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. There are 5 pillars of Islam. I can teach you the basics in some other time. One of them is zakat, the charity. And so one of the categories of charity is wafir riqab, and freeing slaves. So here you have 2 things. You have an emancipatory discourse in chapter 90, Surah Al-Balad, and then you have the Quran saying one of the obligations, which is zakat, you have to spend the money to emancipate slaves. And then we have all of these ahadith of the Prophet Muhammad telling us of the virtue of freeing slaves. Now, this already has refuted almost everything that he has said. Let's move to the Bible now for a nice discussion about Numbers chapter number 31, verse number 18, which of course is going to be a difficult verse for my honorable friend, and of course I use the term loosely here, to explain where Moses is told to go into the town, and he is take the young girls for yourself. Now what young girls is he talking about here? When you look at the Babylonian Talmud, which is actually exegetes this particular verse, is talking about prepubescent girls. So Moses is being instructed to take prepubescent girls for yourself as captives. Now the idea is this: I want to know of a single verse of the Quran or a single hadith where prepubescent girls are told to be taken as captives in this manner. In fact, not only this, but if they believe that Jesus is God, because he is part of the Trinity, and therefore he's actually the author of the Old Testament as well, isn't he? Because he's God and he's inseparable from the rest of the Trinity, right? So of course, you have a double problem here. Jesus Christ, therefore, is the one that is commanding Moses to go and take captives, which are girls, for himself in chapter 31, verse 18 of Numbers. So this refutes the secondary claim that he had, that Jesus was completely disassociated from these slaves. So you have 2 things here. You have a complete refutation of the fact that there's not an emancipatory discourse, which there is, and then you have a charge which I'm putting forward to this subpar opponent who will have no tools of being able to answer this question. That number 1 was Moses being commanded to take slaves, but also that Jesus commanded this as well.
Your turn.
All right. So Mohammed here calls me subpar, but both the points he raised are really subpar. Let's look at both of them carefully. What happened in the book of Numbers? Read the verse carefully. The context corresponds to Moabites. You might have heard about a person called Balaam acting on behalf of the Moabites, leading the nation of Israel to sexual immorality and thereby allowing Balaam to be able to curse the nation of Israel. That's the historical context. People who were involved in sexual immorality. With that as the backdrop, what Moses said, Mohammed, is that you need to read the verse carefully. It wasn't talking about pre-puberty. Nothing about adolescence or puberty is discussed. If you read the verse carefully, all that it would talk about is girls or ladies who did not have intimacy with men. What was he talking about? What he was talking about was those who did not lead you to sexual immorality. Those kinds of girls, I challenge Mohammed, why did you mention puberty? You need to show me that from the Bible. While the Bible talks about intimacy, number one. Number two, the Bible, show to me where these ladies were taken as captives. Read the Bible carefully. What you would find is that everyone else were wiped out, whereas these were allowed to live along with the nation of Israel. That is what you would find. So find one example from the Bible. From the Bible, anywhere, old, new, anywhere you want to go to, Muhammad, and find at the end of the war where women are taken as captive to be held as slaves. Find one example and then let's talk about facts. The problem is this: Muhammad is a Muslim, and therefore clearly he is going to have his issues with his eyes. The problem anywhere, everywhere, whatever he reads, he is going to read Islam into it. Why do I say he is reading Islam into biblical verses? Nowhere in the Bible you would see these women being taken as captives and made slaves to the people. You don't find that in the Bible, yet he reads that. And the reason for that is Muhammad allowed slavery to continue until the end of his life. Sahih al-Bukhari, you say slavery, slaves were manumitted, and that's one of the 5 pillars. Sahih al-Bukhari disagrees with you. Chapter 3, verse, saying 765. 765. Sahih al-Bukhari 3, 765. Narrated Turib, the free slave of Ibn Abbas. That Maimuna bin al-Harith told him that she manumitted a slave girl without taking the permission of the Prophet. A person comes to Muhammad and she says, I have manumitted a slave. The great Islamic Allah, who he thinks allowed Islamic Prophet to manumit slaves, do you know what he says? He says, why did you do it? Why did you let her go? Whereas the Bible dislikes the idea of people being taken as captive slaves, women especially, Muhammad here goes on to say, you would have got more reward if you had given her to one of your maternal uncles. So the idea that the so-called prophet called Muhammad implemented manumission of slaves is a fantasy idea, doesn't correspond to reality. Let me ask you this, Muhammad.
Time's finished. All right. Well, thank you for that. Unfortunately, you haven't done a good job in answering my interrogation. Actually, the verse says, take the little ones for yourself. This is chapter 31, verse 18 of Numbers. Take them for yourself. And if you're saying this doesn't imply captivity, if you're saying this does not imply captivity, then you'll be going against all halakhic understandings by the Jewish people who have been interpreting this for decades, in fact, actually millennia. And I will say to you once again, go back to the Jerusalem Talmud. There's 2 Talmuds, the Babylonian one and the Jerusalem one. Go and see what the rabbis have said in relation to this verse. They clearly understood it to mean captivity. Okay, you don't like this verse. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 2, where it talks about going the way of the Amalekites and don't leave anything alive, and even the donkey, women, children, and even the donkey. And other places it says kill everything. So actually, the injunctions in Numbers chapter 31, verse 18, are a step down, even though they mean captivity for women. They're a step down from what we find in 1 Samuel 15. Because in 1 Samuel 15, we see everybody's genocided and everybody's killed. And once again, we have to bring to the attention of the Christian community that you may say this is the Old Testament and it's something we don't want to associate with. But if you believe that Jesus is inseparable from the Trinity, then you believe that he was the author of the Old Testament, which means that at least at one point in time, he must have ordered Moses to do those genocides and kill those children and kill those animals. This is clear. And this is the understanding of the rabbis, and this is the understanding, quite frankly, of even reformers, theologians like John Calvin, who exegeted the Bible. Look at how people exegeted the Bible away from this pathetic apologism that you're finding here from these people. You'll find that it's a consistent theme, that they understood it in the way of genocide and captivity and slavery. In fact, racial slavery, which he had the audacity to accuse our Prophet of, despite the fact that he is the only man, and Islam is the only religion which categorically forbids racism. And I say that to you, get me one verse of the Bible which has the equivalent of saying racism is wrong. I can get you a hadith straight away. La fadla li Arabiyyin ala ajami. That there's no virtue over an Arab over a non-Arab, or a black man over a white man, and that the best of you are those most in virtue. Get me the equivalent of that in the Bible. We find the opposite in the Bible. Genesis chapter 9 verse number 22, we find the curse of Ham. Noah had 3 sons, and the biblical exegete said the curse of Ham was that he was cursed with black skin, curly hair, and slavery. And you see now, those who justify slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, obviously some use the Bible to I will be honest, to attack slavery as well. But for the majority of those who promulgated slavery, use this curse of Ham as a justification. You can't come to me and talk about slavery. You can't come to me and talk about racism. Because the Bible, there is nothing in the Bible that forbids racism. We have Jesus Christ. Is it time?
20 seconds.
20 seconds. We have Jesus Christ. In the New Testament, we have Jesus Christ shunning the Gentile woman and calling her of the dogs. This is racism, with all due respect. She's a dog because she's not a Jew. So here we find, my challenge is very clear. One verse of the Bible which categorically rejects slavery, and how do you deal with those verses that I told you in chapter 90 and chapter 9?
Finish.
Yeah.
Mohammed Hijab should get to know the topic first clearly. If you're going to talk about genocide as the Bible advocate, we can get to that later. The point is pretty simple, Mohammed. If you want to listen here, the point is pretty simple. The entire narration of the nation of Israel was about God redeeming a people group who were slaves, oppressed slaves. Redeeming them and giving them liberty is the entire Old Testament, the beginning of the Old Testament. And Exodus chapter 22, verse 21, soon after God brings them out, this is what he says: not to mistreat a stranger or oppress him, because you were strangers in Egypt. The challenge that I had for you is very simple, Mohammed. Find one evidence. Read to me one evidence where you find people who are brought under captivity and made slaves to live with Israel, to be slaves with Israel. You won't be able to find. In contrast, what you will find is that in the Bible, you find God advocate similar law for foreigners and for the nation of Israel. God forbidding kidnapping, i.e. taking a person against his will, whether it against his will and bringing him under captivity. You find people given rights, legal rights given to those who are working in Egypt. Exodus 22:21, not to mistreat a stranger or oppress him. No unfair treatment, no forced marriage. Jesus says there is neither, New Testament says, Galatians 3:28, there is neither a Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. Excuse me, one sec. There is neither male nor female. So if you go through the Bible, the entire story about the Bible is redemption of slaves and people being made to live as free human beings, only with obligation under God. In contrast, what do you find? In contrast, you find Muhammad. Excuse me. In contrast, you find Muhammad having deep racism. Muhammad thinking 2 black people are equal to 1 Arab slave. Sahih Muslim 10-3901. Sahih al-Bukhari 9-89-256. That black people were raised in heads. Muhammad himself owned black slaves. Sahih Muslim 10-3901. 52334. Al-Tabari talking about black slavery, explaining it as the Africans having come from Ham and therefore ought to be enslaved. Tirmidhi Hadith 38, Muhammad says, when Allah created Adam, he stroked his right shoulder and took out a black race as if they were coals. Then he said to those who were on this right side toward paradise, and I don't care. He said to those who were on his left shoulder towards hell, and I don't care. What you find here is Muhammad saying all black people are destined to go to hell, and he doesn't even care about this.
That's quite
Not just
ridiculous,
this. Muhammad also considered anyone who is not a Muslim to be like cattle, like pigs, like sheep, cows, camels. And therefore, no wonder you find in Islam very evil treatment of unbelievers, non-Muslims, when they are caught during a war. What happens to them? They are taken, females are taken as sex slaves. Quran, Surah 4, Ayah 3. Surah 4, Ayah 24.
Time finish. We'll get to 4-3 in the next.
No, you under his mic.
All right. So
Would
yeah,
you, could
are
you,
we time?
is he with you? Could you please ask him not to disturb in the middle of
no one
in the middle of
no one's with me here today. Everyone's coming from their own homes. Ready? All right. So he wanted something on the Bible. I gave him Deuteronomy. I gave him. You can go to Deuteronomy as well, chapter 21. That's something that. Or you can also go to Numbers 31:18, and you can go to 1 Samuel's. And the reason why I was mentioning genocide was because if the Bible, the biblical commandment was to kill the people, enslaving them is one notch below that. So it doesn't make sense to talk about morality when you're talking about going into an entire village of Amalekites and destroying and killing the entire population, not leaving even the animals to be alive. There is no such injunction that you will find anywhere in the Quran, and I once again challenge you to find me a single verse or a single hadith to that effect. Now, pardon?
21.
Yeah, no, it's not 21. Get it? Yeah, so now let's quickly talk about what he talked about. The hadiths that he mentioned were false. That the black people on the right and the left. This is not, the word used in that hadith was not black. The word was dark. And this was in the Quran, وُجُوهُهُمْ مُسْوَدَّةٌ, that they will have darkened faces. And in fact, ironically, this kind of language is used when men practice something called infanticide. When they kill daughters that are girls, that their faces will be darkened and so on, and there's a reprimand in the Quran for that. It doesn't mean that it's talking about the race. And he talks about 2 black people being the thing for one. How is that the case? When Bilal ibn Rabah was bought by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq for a high price, very, very high price, and then when he was told afterwards, he said, I would have paid even more for him. So this is nonsense what you're talking about. Bilal ibn Rabah, which everyone knows who he is, married Hala bint Auf, who was an Arab, and he became the mu'adhin of the higher echelons of that particular Islamic society. There was no mention of his race in the derogatory way whatsoever. In fact, we have a narration where Bilal was actually abused by Abu Dharr al-Ghifari because he said to him that you're the son of a black woman. The Prophet got angry and he responded by saying, what have you said, and reprimanded him and told him not to say such a thing. So all of what you're doing is distorting and completely decontextualizing that which is correct. You haven't actually had any response for that which I've mentioned, which is that Jesus Christ, who is meant to be inseparable from the body of the Trinity, he is inseparable from the Trinity. He is the one who commanded to genocide and to enslave. You'll find in Numbers 31:18, you'll find in Deuteronomy chapter 21:10, you'll find in First Samuel chapter 15 verse 2, and this, look, you find here, whoever strikes his male or female servant, this is Exodus chapter 21 verse 20, whoever strikes his male or female servant with a staff, and if they have died by his hands, he shall be guilty of a crime, but if he survives for 1 day or 2, he shall not be subject to punishment because it is his money. You see, if he beats him so badly, that he doesn't survive, he doesn't get any crime because it is his money. This is the heart of objectification, of commodification, of all the things that you're accusing Islam of. You have no answer, my friend, to the emancipatory discourse that we find in Surah Al-Baqarah chapter number 90, and the fact that freeing slaves was something which is in the zakat, obligatory. Also, you'll find in chapter number 24, verse 33, that it's mentioned mukataba. And mukataba is the idea of somebody comes who is enslaved, and according to one opinion, according to Tafsir al-Qurtubi, that they have to be freed. If they say we don't want to, we want to ransom ourselves, they're enslaved. So in other words, the so-called master, you have to be freed. So that's another thing you can bring.
Time.
Go ahead.
All right, Muhammad is repeating his same erroneous points again. Who is Muhammad Hijab? Let's ask that simple question. His own scholar, Islamic scholar, says Muhammad Hijab is an infidel. Why do I say this? Because his own Islamic scholar, Sheikh Saleh Al-Fawzan, says slavery is part of Islam. Slavery is part of Islam. Slavery is part of jihad, and jihad will remain as long as there is Islam. So slavery is part of Islam, slavery is part of jihad, and jihad will remain as long as there is Islam. And he goes on to say, they are ignorant people like Muhammad Hijab here who think slavery, Islamic slavery has been abolished, are ignorant. They are not scholars. He said of people who express such opinions, they are merely writers. Whoever says such things is an infidel. Why does Muhammad Hijab say what he says at Hyde Park? Because he knows he can't say what this gentleman said from Saudi Arabia in a nation like ours. He knows it. If he says what he says from Saudi Arabia, he knows Islam would not spread even the tiny little bit it is attempting to do now. And that is why he doesn't do it. And that is why the Saudi Arabian Sheikh calls him an infidel. What do we find? He said Bilal was a black guy and treated with great respect. Bilal said to Abu Bakr, my dear friend Sahih al-Bukhari says, 557.99, it says, Bilal, even up to the time of Abu Bakr, remained a slave. And that is very important for you to know. I don't care what he did. I don't care if he called people to pray. I don't care if he sung a few songs or any of those things. The question is, how did Muhammad treat him? Muhammad treated Bilal as a slave. So continued Abu Bakr. Muhammad was quite happy with this. He was quite happy with slaves continuing as slaves until the end of Islam, which is the end of times according to Islam, according to Muhammad Hijab and any other knowledgeable Muslim. So the problem is this: in Islam, blacks, unbelievers, especially women, are treated in a bad way. They are seen as cattle, pigs, all sorts of derogatory terms. This resulted in harsh treatments of sex torture. Female slaves were tortured. Quran Surah 4:24. Quran Surah 4 verse 3. Surah 4 Ayah 29 and so on. Please answer, Muhammad, if the Quran says that Muslims can take any of the captive women who their right hands possess and have sex with them at any stage, any stage. Do you agree with this? If you had a wife who is a non-Muslim, and if Muslims were to get hold of her and say, she is my captive, I can do what I want to do with her, will you be happy? I'm assuming you won't be. And therefore, you need to agree, Islam does terrible things with slaves.
I'm assuming.
Like I said earlier, Bilal, manumission, a great one of 5 pillars according to Muhammad. The problem, like I said earlier, Surah Sahih al-Bukhari, 3765, Sahih al-Bukhari 55799. Both of them are against this. Slaves were asked to continue as slaves.
All right, let's one more each, yeah. 'Cause we don't want to spend like another 2 hours.
it's game
I think it's settled after one. I'm gonna say this again. I have one, then you have one, and then I finish because you started. Okay?
Yes. So
Yeah.
so you.
Me, I'm gonna speak, then you, then I conclude, and then that's it. Yeah. Was that 2 rounds each?
No, one more. Yeah.
So 424 وَالْمُحْصَنَاتُ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ إِلَّا مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ. Where does it say you can have sex with slaves at any time and all this stuff that you're talking about? Doesn't say that at all. All it says is that you're not allowed to marry a woman who's married except what your right hand possesses. What your right hand possesses doesn't mean that you can have sex with them whenever you want. In fact, the idea of raping a woman, whether she is a slave or whether she's a wife, has been spoken about by the Salaf of this ummah, or the predecessors. Al-Shafi'i mentions it in Kitab al-Umm. Even Imam Malik mentions it, and the punishment of it is a corporal punishment, something like whipping and so on and so forth. So this is not something that Islam endorses at all. And the evidence of that is the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad where he says, "La darar wa la dirar." You can't harm or reciprocate harm. How can you rape a woman, whoever she may be, in Islam without causing harm? So this is something that is completely falsehood, and it is a projection that he has of his own religion onto mine. Because the truth of the matter is, what we've said today is, number one, you have the verse in Numbers 31:18. We have Deuteronomy 21:10. We have Exodus that we've spoken about. We've spoken about, and there's other verses. There's so many of them that I can't even enumerate them in the short space that I have today. They have been understood by biblical commentators, both Jewish and Christian, aforetime, including those writers of the Jerusalem Talmud and others, as meaning captivity and genocide. And that's why sophisticated theologians of the 21st century and even the 20th century admit this candidly. They admit this candidly, and therefore they make some excuse to disband in the Old Testament, and they try and pretend as if it doesn't exist. The truth of the matter is, if you believe Jesus is God, then he is inseparable from the Old Testament authorship, which means he is the one who commanded Moses to do all of those things. If he is the God, he's the one who commanded the people to genocide. He is the one who commanded the people to enslave and so on and so forth. He is the one who said, here's your money when it comes to beating and abusing the slaves, and so on and so forth. These verses have had no good response today. Bilal did not remain a slave for all of Islam. This is a falsehood. In fact, that's impossible. He married Hala bint Auf, and he gave her a mahar, and she was a free woman, and he was a free man. This was absolutely established in the Sunnah, and he had children with her, and those children were in fact half white, half black, half Arab. Nobody ostracized him except that they would meet the reprimand of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as in the case of Abu Dharr al-Ghafari in the well-known hadith. So therefore, this notion that Islam is a racist religion is something you cannot substantiate. Moreover, it's something you will not be able to find in the Bible a single verse which has condemnatory tone or an explicit remark relating to racism being a bad thing. So what have we established today? Number one, the Quran has an emancipatory discourse, as mentioned in chapter 90, and as mentioned in Surah At-Tawbah, and as mentioned in chapter 24, verse 33. We have mentioned that there are opinions of the Salaf that say that a slave can literally force themselves out of slavery through ransom. It's called mukataba. فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ إِنْ عَلِمْتُمْ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا. That give them mukataba, ransom, if they know good, if you know good in them. And according to Al-Qurtubi, that some Salaf said this is by way of wujub, which means it's obligatory, even if the slave master didn't want it. Which is, if this opinion is respected, as good as abolition. This is as good as abolition. If this opinion is not respected, then it's not. He talked about Shaykh Salah al-Fawzan. I'll mention that in the conclusion.
Yes, start. Okay, all Muslims have a very important question to ask today. On the one hand, you have the Bible. A claim is made that Islam and the Bible, the New Testament and the Old Testament are Abrahamic in origin. But what we find are clear differences in the Bible We don't talk about racism. We don't talk about abolishing of slavery in the way that he wants them to be spoken of, because the Bible never had slavery like what Islam ever had. What you find in the Bible is the story of God empathizing with slaves, the nation of Israel, redeeming them and leading them on to freedom. This is the story asked. And on the back of that, God in the Bible says, Exodus 22:21, He says, not to mistreat a stranger or oppress him, because you yourselves were strangers in Egypt. So across the Bible, what you find is God of the Bible demanding fair treatment of everyone, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, language spoken, and so on. And God is seen as God who is impartial in the Bible. And I asked Mohammed multiple times, can you show me a place where women were taken as sex captives? And he couldn't show that. All that he's talking about are a few places where there was political war and entire people groups were asked to be wiped out by God. Now God, my God, God of the Bible judges. If he has a problem with that, well, I can only say judgment is coming. And a few of these judgments came in the past, Amalekites and so on. Judgments came. In contrast, what do you find in Islam? In Islam, Islam clearly says that the black people are not worth as much as the Arabs. One Arab guy is worth two black guys. Black people are like raisin heads, unbelievers are like cattle, and so on. And this resulted in very harsh treatments. Sex torture of female slaves, you find in various portions of the Hadith and Quran 4:3, 4:24, Surah Al-Kubra 2:227, and so on. Multiple places you find sex torture of female slaves, Umar torturing female slaves. No rights being given. Quran Surah 16 ayah 75 says slaves control nothing, no right whatsoever, and that free men cannot be punished for the murder of a slave. Quran Surah 2 ayah 178, also repeated in Tafsir Jalalain. So the point is, torture of sex slaves, no rights. Free men are not equal to the slaves, so clearly no equal treatment. And this therefore resulted in Muhammad not permitting or not allowing manumission to happen. Sahih al-Bukhari 5:57-99, 3:765. You find Bilal continuing as a slave. If Bilal says this to Abu Bakr, if you have bought me for yourself, Sahih al-Bukhari 5:57-99. If you have bought me for yourself, then keep me for yourself. But if you have bought me for Allah's sake, then leave me for Allah's work. He is pleading. This great guy, who is the one who calls people and to pray for prayer, he is pleading. If you have bought me for the sake of Allah, leave me alone. But you are still keeping me as a slave. So Muhammad continuing to keep people as slaves. Sahih al-Bukhari 3:765, 5:541, and so on. Slaves working for Muhammad.
Time. You know, he said that the Quran says that disbelievers are like cattle. It doesn't say that. It says belhum illa kal an'ami belhum adallu sabila. That they are like cattle. No. They are more astray than the cattle. And as we've seen today,
Worse than cattle. Worse than cattle.
Yeah. You know what I'm saying? As we've seen
Cattles
today,
are better.
when the truth, okay, be quiet now, please. Don't waste my time. As we've seen today, everybody, we have seen today that is the case. You're presented with straight facts and you cannot maneuver away from them. You cannot circumnavigate them. You cannot deal with them. You cannot hermeneutically, acrobatically, gymnastically get away from them. And the reality of the situation is you're dealt with the blunt truth in front of your face, as clear as the day, and you're just scurrying, scared, and anxious like me, without a pen in my hand, knowing your scriptures more than you, and knowing my scriptures more than you'll ever know, dealing with you in the way that I've dealt with you. The truth of the matter is, it was actually abrogated. Chapter 2 verse 178 abrogated with the ayat al-Ma'idah, which is talking an eye for an eye, number one. So that's, and it wasn't what he thought it meant anyway, but it was abrogated in either event. Number one. Point number two, you keep mentioning Bilal. Yeah. Bilal was not a slave when he married Hala bint Auf. He was not a slave when he was literally ascending the Kaaba, telling the people, I'm in charge now, reciting the call to prayer in front of all the Arabs who are literally below him in physical stature. How dare you talk about Bilal in that manner when the Prophet said he will be the one, he can hear his footsteps in Jannah. The things that he said about all the hadiths about black people being in hell, every single one of them is false. None of those hadiths use the word black, none of them. In fact, like I said, the opposite is true. We have explicit statements from the Prophet saying there's no virtue over a black man over a white man, or a white man over a black man, an Arab over a non-Arab. There is no such statement in the Bible. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, we find these genocides of the Amalekites, who he admits to. He says this is them asking for it, basically. We want to be destroyed. No one asked for genocide, sorry to say. This is the kind of kalam that we find the Israelis doing with the Palestinians, inspired by that horrible Old Testament narrative. Moreover, now let's be honest. Let's be honest and say that even the New Testament, Jesus calling a non-Jewish person a dog. Yes, at the end of it, he said, okay, I'll give you whatever you want. But he still called her a dog because she was a Gentile. That's racism. Your book is fraught, saturated, filled, contaminated, polluted. It is seeping, brimming with racism, brimming with genocide, brimming with racism. You need us, my friend. We don't need anything from you. You come to us and you ask us, why was everything abrogated in the way it was? Because the Prophet Muhammad eliminated racism, the only person in his time to do so, and it was the only emancipatory discourse of any Abrahamic religion in the world, that is Islam. Come to it and stop being arrogant.
All right, thank you very much, Mohammed. Let's try and deal with here.
Wow. Oh, no answer.
Please. All the Muslims who would like to challenge that further, please come over here.
Do your homework first.
Please come over here.
Go do your homework first.
Please come over here.
Hijab, very good, man.
How are you, man? You finished here, man. Good.